are special prayers that are said in the synagogue for someone who is ill. We use the person's Hebrew name, and we use the person's mother's name, actually, not the father's name, because the rabbis explained the prayers of a mother are more penetrating, are more powerful, more penetrating to the divine throne. So we're prepared to talk to the patient in clear ways about the seriousness of their illness, of their condition, but we don't want to, as I said, take away their hope to live. One of the things that in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years has become more and more popular in the Jewish community and, of course, the general community is the importance of a living will, an ethical will, a health proxy that we provide within the Jewish community for people to make decisions, medical decisions based upon different scenarios, all within the framework of Jewish ethics. And as I'm sure you're aware, the general advice is that every 2 years a person should update their ethical will, every year or two, update it, because their frame of mind changes, etc. Obviously, we look at each situation, each patient individually, but just from a general perspective, from a Jewish ethical standpoint, we believe it's meritorious to prolong the living process. And in your run-of-the-mill kind of situation where a person needs medical attention, from an ethical standpoint, they're not permitted to refuse medical treatment. Okay? We believe that our lives are a gift to us from God. They're on loan to us from God. And God gives us, whatever it may be, 60 years, 80 years, 120 years, and then God decides to call in his loan. And that's why we're not permitted to do anything to willfully harm ourselves. And so if someone is ill and that illness can be treated, can be addressed, the patient has an ethical obligation to seek treatment. Just like the healthcare providers, physicians, nurses, etc., have an ethical obligation to treat the person. We do not, however, believe it's meritorious to prolong the dying process. Now, I say that, but we're never prepared, of course, to abandon a patient. Even where curing is no longer possible, that's where caring has to take over, to make the patient as comfortable as possible, treat the patient with painkillers. And we believe that even if in the treatment of the person's pain, it may slow their rate of respiration, that is still an appropriate approach to take, because our goal is not to kill the patient, but our goal is to lessen the person's pain. Again, we evaluate each case individually, but basic level of nutrition and hydration we do not view as heroic measures, but rather as a basic level of care that no patient should be denied. And from a biblical standpoint, because of the sanctity of life, that's what we're taught literally at the beginning. God creates a world filled with everything, vegetation, mountains, animals, rivers, and the most important creation, human beings. God creates one man and one woman and says, okay, you get it started. One of the lessons is to teach us the sanctity of life, how valued each individual life is. And so from a biblical perspective, a person who has 1 hour to live, that life is as sanctified as someone who's going to live another 70 years. So we don't do anything to hasten the person's death. If, as I said, curing is no longer possible, we want to make the person as comfortable as possible. And just to lead into the spiritual considerations, so in Jewish tradition, there is what we call the vidui, the final confession that's recited by the patient. If the patient is able to, he or she recites it. If they're not able to, then someone can say it on their behalf. And part of it says, God, if I am to die, let this my final confession be an atonement for all my sins. And if I am not to die, let this my confession be an atonement and spur me into many more years of life. Now, you cannot get more starkly honest than having the patient say, if I am to die. That's really dealing with the situation head on. But as I just recited to you, the prayer also has a hopeful note to it. If I am not to die. So, as I pointed out a few times, we don't want to say or do anything that takes away a person's will to live. And so, if the person is not conscious or the patient's in a coma, then could be the rabbi, could be a friend, could be a member of the family who recites this final confession. Regardless of the patient's condition, we always want to maintain respectful behavior in the presence of the patient, respectful talk in the presence of the patient. The Talmud tells us that the presence of God is with the patient in that hospital room or in his bedroom if he's getting home care. And we don't want to do anything that could, God forbid, hasten the person's life. And so, except for medical things that need to be done when the person is in the last hours or days, it's kind of hard to define, of life. We don't want to touch the patient and move the patient. That's a time when prayers are said. The recitation from the book of Psalms is appropriate, and that's at the same time as we've already discussed with the patient, even funeral arrangements. If a person is a member of a congregation, of a synagogue, so very often their spiritual leader, their rabbi, has visited the person. As community chaplain with Jewish Family Service, I work with people in the community who are not members of a congregation to meet their needs. We're talking about here at the end of life. So the role of a rabbi, like the role of a chaplain or a clergyman in other faiths, is to visit the patient, to recite prayers, and also to serve the important function of counseling for the family, both when the person is ill, critically ill, and after the person passes away. What is recommended to the family is that when the person passes away, they have two phone calls to make. One is to their rabbi, and the other is to the funeral director with whom they have made arrangements. And we very much recommend to people that they make pre-arrangements with a funeral home. Part of the pre-arrangements is as well with a cemetery in terms of purchase of a burial plot. And so those arrangements with the cemetery, with the funeral director, are made ahead of time. one phone call is made to the funeral director, and then he or she then starts the process in terms of arranging a transportation of the deceased to the funeral home, et cetera, et cetera. The obvious advantage is that the family members need not deal with all of this once the loss has occurred, once the person passed away. Uh, Family members, children don't have to go down to the office of the funeral home to sign papers. They don't have to pick out a casket. All that has been done. Right? In many cases, it's the person himself or herself, the patient, who has made all of these arrangements. But the idea is behind it, obviously, to spare the family from having to deal with all these details and all the papers and forms to sign when they should be concentrating on other things. They need to concentrate on alerting family members and friends. When the funeral is, as we're all well aware in this past year, what's become the norm is, a few people actually come to the cemetery for the funeral. Everyone else watches it on Zoom, and that's unfortunately what we're going through. In the Jewish community, we have what's called the Chevra Kadisha, literally means the Holy Society. That's the Jewish Burial Society. Some congregations in Dallas have their own. And then we also have a Dallas Jewish Burial Society. I'm proud to say I'm one of the founders of it. My wife of blessed memory was also a founder and very active participant. These are volunteers, men and women, who prepare the body for burial. In Jewish tradition, there's a ritual washing of the body. A team of women to deal with a female deceased and men for a man. Prayers are said. It's a very solemn occasion. There's no talking during when this is done. It's usually a team of 4 or 5 people. And Dallas Jewish Funeral Home and other funeral homes we work with in Dallas have a room, an area that's set up for the team to come in, the burial society to come in. The body is washed. In Jewish tradition, we do not permit embalming. We take the natural approach. Even bodies that have to be shipped out of state or sent to Israel for burial, there's no requirement that the body be embalmed. If the person is sent out of state or out of the country, the deceased is put into a plastic bag, and the body is then put into a metal container, and that's how the body is shipped. Okay. So the burial society comes in, the washing of the body, the dressing of the body in shrouds. White linen shrouds, one set of shrouds for a woman, one for a man. That's the traditional approach, and the concept behind it is the following. One of the things that separates people, during our lifetime is clothing. Some people wear more expensive clothing, other people wear less expensive clothing. Some people wear clothing that's in style. Some people wear clothing that hope it comes back into style. You know how it goes. So clothing is one of the things that separates people. Death, the great equalizer, we treat everyone the same. And so that's the purpose of shrouds. In Jewish tradition, a person is buried in a plain pine box. Just as a side point, caskets, the use of caskets in the world, came into existence in Europe, Western Europe, late Middle Ages, where because of hygienic reasons, local laws began requiring the use of a casket. So at that point, the rabbi stepped in and said, okay, we are required to use a casket, but we're going to use a plain wooden casket. The idea is, again, to treat everyone with the same element of respect. If on Monday a guy's being buried in the Rolls Royce of caskets, padding and a pillow, etc., and then on Tuesday there's another guy buried in a plain box, people say, oh, he couldn't afford the more important, the more expensive model. So whether he was the mayor of the city, whether he was a wealthy individual, regardless of his station in life economically or in any other way, everyone is buried in the same casket. In Israel, actually, they do it by the original Jewish practice. Caskets are not used, except in the case of, God forbid, a soldier who's killed in battle or someone who's the victim of a terrorist attack. Otherwise, the person is clothed in shrouds. A man is then wrapped in his tallis, his prayer shawl, and that's what we do here as well. And a woman is wrapped in a white sheet, and the body is carried on a stretcher and lowered into the grave, and the stretcher is taken out. So obviously in America we use caskets, but a plain, that's the traditional approach, a plain a pine box, and the person is buried in the ground. That's also part of ancient Jewish tradition. Going back to Genesis, when Sarah dies, so Abraham purchases a plot of land in the city of Hebron to bury Sarah in. So we consider burial in the ground. From a traditional point of view, we don't do mausoleums. Cremation, which unfortunately has become very popular in all segments of the population, is really the antithesis of Jewish tradition, of biblical law. And then going back to what I mentioned earlier, the sanctity of every person, we believe that even after a person passes away, the body still has holiness to it. Because even though the soul has departed from the body is called a holy vessel because it housed a soul of a human being. And so, like I said, cremation is really the antithesis of Jewish practice. And from a biblical standpoint, say it's not appropriate for any person, because every human being is created in the image of God. And so any disrespect that's shown to a human being, whether it's during a person's lifetime or after they've been called to their eternal reward, we consider that disrespectful. Now, in Jewish tradition, we hold the funeral as soon as possible, prompt funeral. Obviously, different faiths take different approaches, and that's certainly fine. But in Jewish tradition, we bury a person as soon as possible. I've officiated funerals where the person died 6 a.m. and we had the funeral at 4 in the afternoon. All the family members were in town. There's no reason to delay. In most cases, certainly the burial is usually done the next day. Under extenuating circumstances, we will delay burial. We don't have Jewish funerals on the Sabbath, on the Jewish Sabbath. So someone dies on Friday afternoon, the funeral would be on Sunday. We're coming up in a couple of weeks to the holiday of Passover, for example. So Passover, the first 2 days, which are considered full holidays, which we don't go to work, etc. So those 2 days are on Sunday and Monday. So that means we have 3 days in a row: the Shabbat, the Sabbath, Sunday, and Monday. So God forbid somebody dies Friday afternoon and there's no time to have the funeral on Friday. So the burial would not be until Tuesday. Okay. I mentioned Israel a few moments ago. Israel is the only place in the world, in the Jewish world, where they actually have funerals at night. So someone dies Friday night in Israel, the burial will be Saturday night, even during summertime when the Sabbath is over late, because of sundown being late. 11 o'clock Saturday night, they'll have a funeral. We don't do that in America. Two main reasons. One, I don't know if you ever noticed, there are no lights at a cemetery. So it'd be kind of hard to do it in the dark. And then also in those cities where you have unions for the cemetery workers, you can't fight the unions on that. So that's just the normal part of Jewish life. The idea is the Sabbath is of paramount importance. We're prepared and in fact mandated to desecrate the Sabbath when there's a danger or a potential danger to the life of an individual. It's not that we're permitted to desecrate the Sabbath or the Day of Atonement. We're required to when I'm faced with a situation of a potentially life-threatening situation. But once the person has passed away, then we don't have this funeral on the Sabbath. Just to back up a step, from the time that the deceased is brought to the funeral home until the burial, all the funeral homes in Dallas that the Jewish community works with, they have under their employ what's called a shomer, a watchman, someone or a series of people who stay with the body, either in the room or outside the room, from the time of death until burial. It's a way of showing respect to the individual, that the human being, even after he or she has passed away, a human being is not abandoned. A human being, a deceased human being, is not left alone. So that's traditionally one of the arrangements that's made with the funeral home. I said it could be one person, could be a rotation. Sometimes there are family members who will come to the funeral home for a couple of hours to recite prayers, or friends of the deceased. Again, it's another way of showing respect. The common element in all I've mentioned so far is showing respect to the individual. Okay, then just a few more words, and I'll be ready for your questions. As I said, we try to have the burial as soon as possible. All the rituals and customs of mourning in Judaism are man-made. And so the rabbis who had a keen understanding of the human psyche, human personality, when they introduced certain rituals, each one had a reason behind it. At the funeral, eulogies are said, prayers are recited, and then when it comes to the actual burial, first family members, the mourners, are given the opportunity to begin the burial. If they're, emotionally up to doing it, emotionally and physically up to doing it. When I say mourners, there are 7 categories of mourners, of family members, where rituals of mourning are observed. That's following the loss of a mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, and spouse. So there are 2 types of mourning. There are the rituals of mourning, and I'll give you a few examples. And also there are feelings of mourning. The rituals of mourning have a finite time frame to them, as I'll describe, and limited to those relatives I just mentioned. The feelings of mourning, the feelings of loss, those that do not know any calendar, and they're not limited to those 7 relatives. If someone experiences the loss of a grandparent, so they feel a deep loss, but they don't observe any of the rituals of mourning. We limit it to those 7 relatives. So the family begins the actual burial. And one of the reasons is it's a way for the person to deal honestly with their loss. It's interesting, between the time of death of the relative and burial, the mourners are not allowed to drink, wine, for example. Why? We don't want them trying to wash away their sorrow, right? Again, we've seen movies, TV shows, someone dies and they go down to the corner bar to wash away their loss. Well, when they wake up the next morning, they still have to deal with their loss. And so it's not healthy from an emotional or psychological perspective. So the family begins the burial, and there's no sound in the world like the thud of a clump of dirt hitting a casket. There's no sound like that in the world. And nothing is more real for the next of kin than actually burying their deceased. So in Judaism, we say there are often painful things that occur in a person's life, but the healthy approach is you have to deal with it. You can't run away from it. So the burial is done by family members, by those in attendance. It's considered an act of pure loving kindness, because if you do a favor for someone during their lifetime, there's always the possibility that they can reciprocate. I don't know, you loan someone money. It could be 5 years down the road, they'll return the favor. But when you meet the final needs of an individual, you're burying them, that's purely for selfless reasons, because they can never repay you. So once burial has taken place, there are traditional words of condolences that are offered to the family members. And then begins the first period of mourning called Shiva. The word Shiva means 7, Shiva, Shiva, 7-day mourning period, which begins with burial. And you count 7 days from there. Many customs are observed in a traditional home. The mourners sit on low chairs. They don't sit on regular chairs. The idea is when we sit on a chair, that's in a social setting. Well, a mourner doesn't participate in normal social activities. So the mourners sit on a low chair that's usually provided by the community, the congregation. Many synagogues have these chairs. They keep them away, in a closet. And when necessary, they'll bring it to the house of the mourner. The idea is that there's a de-emphasis on the physical part of life, since physical life has just ended. One of the traditional aspects of Jewish mourning is the next of kin, the close relatives, tear their garment as a sign of loss. That goes back to the Bible. We're told King David, when his son died, tore his garment. The idea is that the mourner feels rage, feels anger. So rather than tell the person you shouldn't feel like that, Jewish tradition developed that you take something of value, your shirt, a jacket, your blouse, and you tear it as a sign of mourning. There's actually a blessing that the mourner says before they cut their garment, that the blessing says, God, you are the true judge. Meaning what? When a person has been hit by a loss, normal questions go through a person's head. Why did this happen? Why did this happen suddenly? Why was the person sick? Why did someone, God forbid, young die? And in Judaism, we're honest enough to say we don't always have the answers to these questions. God does not make us privy to his wisdom why this happened. There's a reason, but we don't know the reason. So the mourner saying a blessing, God, you are the true judge, is stating that I don't understand why this has happened, but I put my faith in God that there is ultimately a purpose. So there's the 7-day mourning period. Forget about COVID when you couldn't, when you can't visit people, etc. Under normal circumstances, in a traditional setting, religious services are moved to the house of the mourner. The mourner doesn't go to the synagogue for services. Services are held in the house of the mourner for 7 days. On the Sabbath, from Friday night to Saturday night, the mourner can leave the house. He or she takes off their torn clothing. Another traditional part of mourning is the mourner doesn't wear leather shoes, wears non-leather shoes. The mirrors in the house of mourning are covered. Nothing in the house most represents the physical part of life than a mirror. Go past the mirror, you brush your hair, you look, how's your shirt, your blouse straight. Well, these are unimportant during the 7 days of mourning, because we see that physical life is finite. The first meal that the mourners eat when they come back from the funeral is to be prepared by people in the community from their own food, not from that food of the mourner. 2 basic parts to the meal, bread, that makes it a meal, and a hard-boiled egg, Why? The symbolism, a hard-boiled egg is round to emphasize the continuity of life. Yes, death has occurred, but life continues. And whatever else is part of the meal, that's up to the one preparing the meal. But it's specifically food that's brought in for the mourners. In fact, the Talmud says there's a curse on a community that requires their mourners to eat their own food, that they don't even care enough about people to prepare what's called the meal of condolence. So during the 7 days of mourning of Shiva, people visit to offer condolences. So let me just finish up. There's the 7-day period of mourning, and then there are 23 more days, which form a 30-day period. During those 30 days, the mourner doesn't get a haircut, they don't listen to music, they don't go to festive occasions. After 30 days, the rituals of mourning end. As I said earlier, the rituals come to an end, but the feelings of mourning, those don't know any calendar. So those continue. In the case of the loss of a parent, the mourning period is for 12 months. The mourner doesn't go to weddings, they don't listen to music. The idea is to tone down any kind of festive activities. Okay, let me stop here and I'll turn to Beth to share any questions. If we have, I see the number 19 in the chat column here.
Yes, so the first one I have is there a specific ethical will they use, like Jehovah's Witness uses one that covers blood products?
That covers what?
Blood products. And if you want to look at the chat also.
What does that mean, blood products?
I'm sorry, say that again.
What does that mean, blood products? I'm not sure what's meant by that.
Antoinette, can you speak on that?
Please.
Where is
yes, sorry. Jehovah's Witness, according to their faith, cannot have blood or blood products like plasma or...
I mean, like a blood transfusion.
Right. So I'm wondering, is there a specific, and they have a specifically written ethical will for themselves. So I was wondering if the Jewish community did as well.
We have no restrictions whatsoever on receiving blood transfusions or plasma, number of years ago when they used heart valves from a pig. So in Jewish tradition, we don't eat pig, but that has to do with ingestion, not a body part from a pig. No restriction whatsoever. Now, in terms of blood, as we all know, it's always better to give than to receive. But there's no impediment to that whatsoever.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Does the burial team go to the person's location to do the bathing and prayers?
No, that's done at the funeral home. So there are 4 funeral homes in Dallas that the Jewish community works with. And those funeral homes have a room, an area where the team does its job. It's done at the funeral home.
Can you send someone who was not born in Israel to be buried there if that is the person's wish? And do you bury individuals in home?
Bury individuals what?
Do you bury in individuals' homes?
I don't mean it in their home to bury them.
This is from Anima.
I mean, bury them in their backyard.
Anima, unmute yourself.
The first part is yes.
Yes.
I would say relatively uncommon.
Myself.
1 second, about Israel. Yes, you don't have to live in Israel to be buried. Now, because of COVID and everything, not so easy to do that. But the answer is yes. What was the other part of the question about the home?
No, my other question is, can you bury somebody in that person's individual's home?
In that person's city?
That person's individual home. See, the home they live in, can you bury them in there? Inside?
They're
Inside
buried,
the
no,
home.
in a cemetery. And
Okay.
it's not in the home, in the cemetery.
Okay.
If for no other reason, then it would really devalue the house if you buried them in the backyard. So not a good economic move, but it's against the law, actually. You can't just bury a person anywhere. Civil law requires, in a cemetery.
Okay.
Is there a specific Jewish MPOA approved by the state? And in reference to your discussion, can a Jewish person not have an out-of-hospital DNR?
Can you have an out-of-hospital DNR? I think so. I believe so. I mean, that's covered by that ethical will that I mentioned, that certain circumstances, we believe a DNR is an appropriate approach to take. We do not say that in every case, throw at every patient everything that's available medically. We'll talk some other time. I've talked, I think, in other seminars with Faith Presbyterian about a person who's hooked up to a respirator, and then what do you do? But we do not say, as I said earlier, we don't believe it's meritorious to prolong the dying process. The first part of your question I didn't follow, but anyway.
Medical power of attorney. Is there a specific medical power of attorney approved by the state of Texas for Jewish people?
Well, the health proxy that the number of them that are popular within the Jewish community are accepted in every state in the union. They were drawn up with the rabbinic groups and attorneys, so that fully, comply with every state's laws.
Beth, I think it would be very helpful if we could get a link to that, if at all possible. Thank you.
Okay. I'm running myself a note. Yes. Okay.
The question, what was the Jewish word you used for Jewish burial society process?
Oh, the group is called, I'll spell it. Would you like me to spell it in English or Hebrew? No, I'm joking. Okay. Chevra Kadisha. So it's CHEV like Victor, RA. That's the first word. Chevra, which means group. And then Kadisha. KAD like David, ISHA. Chevra Kadisha means the Holy Society.
Any special prayers, face viewing process during the funeral ceremony?
Yeah, usually we say Psalm 91. I mean, all the prayers are from Psalms. We say 91. We say Psalm chapter 23. we say for a woman, not from Psalms, but from the book of Proverbs, chapter 31 in the book of Proverbs, which is entitled A Woman of Valor. That was written by King Solomon as a tribute to his own mother. And traditionally, a husband recites this every Friday night at the start of the Sabbath meal. And so very often this is recited at a funeral, when a woman passes away. Also, chapters 121 and 130 are said at the funerals as well.
Second part of this question, how is the body transferred from the funeral home to the final destination?
A hearse. A hearse. I mean, if it's local, if it's in the city. And the shomer, the watchman that I mentioned earlier, he will ride with the hearse to the cemetery.
Is an autopsy permitted?
Okay, so an autopsy is generally not permitted. We don't permit anything to be done to the body. Sometimes it involves a discussion between the rabbi and the medical examiner. I speak from personal painful experience. A little over a year ago, my wife passed away, was healthy, went to bed Friday night and did not wake up the next morning. Mm-hmm. I was actually out of town on my way to Israel. Because of the circumstances and as what I just described, and she wasn't at home when she passed away, she wasn't with relatives. So I had a couple discussions with the medical examiner. They were very cooperative. Nothing was done. And we'll discuss it with the medical examiner not to do an autopsy. Sometimes you have no choice, certainly in a case where foul play is involved, then you won't be able to prevent it. Generally speaking, no, we don't permit it. Nothing's done to the body. Like I said, the person is, besides the ritual washing, nothing else is done to the body. I have to say my experience has been in working with whether it's people in the community or a congregation. When I was rabbi of a congregation, generally speaking, the medical examiners are respectful and cooperative. According to Dallas law, for example, if a person hasn't seen a doctor in 3 days and they pass away, the medical examiner could order an autopsy. But you have a man, I'm making up, 88 years old, who dies of a heart attack. No great mysteries what he died from. So the ME is not going to order an autopsy. But the answer is no, except in cases where we're bound by local law.
Are there any differences between Orthodox and Reformed?
I mean, some of the customs, I hope you notice I didn't use the word Orthodox once or Reform. I was giving you Jewish tradition. The Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, our community one is unfortunately kept very busy. Many of the referrals are from people who are not Orthodox in practice. They're members of Reformed congregations. So there are differences in terms of customs, ritual, mourning customs. But I would say that the general thrust of respect for the deceased, etc., that's, pretty well maintained. And more, the traditional preparation of the body, etc., has it's become more and more popular, if I can use that word, in non-Orthodox circles in the Jewish community.
A couple more questions. What are the elements of a Jewish funeral service which the deceased may have chosen ahead of time?
Oh, just like I described. I mean, we usually, they'll say, a person can say, I don't want any eulogies recited. That's their prerogative. I had a cousin of mine, my mother, first cousin, religious man, very modest individual. He just had, he didn't want any eulogies. He wanted to be buried the day of his death. His children followed his wishes. So the idea is, since this is done to honor the deceased, so if the deceased says, I don't want any eulogies, okay, then we don't do any eulogies. Did I answer your question? Did I answer the question? So, you know, they'll, the individual will say who they want someone to speak, not to speak, etc. If they had a favorite chapter in the book of Psalms and they'd like that read at the funeral, certainly will accede to their wishes. Absolutely.
Okay. My question really had a lot to do with the fact I was wondering how many parallels there were between, for example, what you would have in a traditional Christian service and what you might have in a traditional Jewish service. And it sounds like there's a lot alike in terms of them speaking towards specific scripture that they might want, having a eulogy, all of that. So it sounds very similar.
Yeah, the recitation of meaning, like from the book of Psalms, you're saying, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Traditionally, I mean, different churches make that, but I'm saying just in a,
But just one thing to remember, we had the book of Psalms first, so.
no kidding. Also, you mentioned that you only once discussed things with a dying patient. So there was one time that you sat down and did that.
Yeah, well, we talked about dying, we talked about the funeral.
Okay, yeah.
Like I said, we don't want to browbeat them with the subject.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah, thank you.
Is a do not resuscitate order allowed in the Jewish faith for someone in the end stages of life?
So the general answer I'll give you is yes. Yes. But again, it depends on the particular circumstances. 84-year-old woman who's suffering from colon cancer and has a history of heart problems, and she's lost weight, and you're worried, they'll break ribs if they try to resuscitate her. There would be a situation where DNR is appropriate, as opposed to, I don't know, someone who's a swimming, a potential drowning victim, right? You can and who's 23 years old, you're going to try to do everything you can to, bring the person back. But the answer to your question is yes. And in the health proxy that I mentioned, it addresses those kinds of circumstances.
So we have quite a few more questions, Rabbi Wolk. So I'm not sure if you want to.
I don't know if you're going to have to put another quarter into the thing, but I'm willing to stay on,
Well, we can definitely continue. But for those of you that have to get off the call.
But let me say thank you, all of you, for joining us. If you have to leave at this point, I understand, no hard feelings, but I am taking down names. So go ahead, Beth.
All right, so we will continue. Thank you guys. If you have to get off, appreciate the continued support. A shout out to our social workers, your dedication to improving the quality of life for everyone that you have in contact. You made this world a better place. So thank you for all your hard work and dedication. Everyone have a great day.
Someone just wrote a question, will there be access to a recording of today's talk? So
what happened, I went offline for whatever reason, had to come back, and it doesn't sound like anybody else was affected by this. So I might have two recordings.
Yeah.
Because I started it once I was able to get back on.
Okay, go ahead with the next question, please.
All right. Can a family choose to get a different casket than a plain pine one?
We would try to, we would certainly discuss it with them, but if that's a decision, the rabbi's not going to fight with them, the burial society is not going to fight with them. We hold the funeral as we would in every other case.
Why non-leather shoes during the mourning period?
Oh, okay, good question. So in Jewish law, only leather shoes are considered technically shoes, because going back to ancient times, that's what they wore, sandals, leather shoes. So there are, like on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the most solemn day of the year, likewise, we don't wear leather shoes. We wear other things, um, a number of years ago when Crocs were first introduced, they had they had a big spike in sales because they were introduced late summertime and they became the most popular footwear for Yom Kippur, for the Day of Atonement. But the idea is this: in ancient times, removing the shoe was considered an act of mourning, and their homes had dirt floors to them. So it hit home the idea that their next of kin has just been buried in the earth, in the dust, and so it made it a more real experience. Yeah. So we continue that by not wearing leather shoes. The mourner can walk around in stocking feet also, but we're blessed with all different kinds of comfortable non-leather shoes. Go ahead, please.
Can you repeat the reference you mentioned at the beginning regarding preservation of life and the COVID vaccine?
Yeah, from chapter 4 in the book of Deuteronomy. I can't remember which verse, but it says you should watch or preserve your lives. Okay. In the book of Exodus, chapter 15, it says, I am the Lord your healer. And then chapter 21 in Exodus, it says, the Bible describes two men get into a fight, one injures the other one, and the one who caused the injury has to make a series of payments, pay damages and unemployment, and it says, he shall surely be healed. And the rabbis explain that means he's got to pay his doctor bills. So the rabbis say, well, it seems to be a contradiction. One says, I am the Lord your healer. The other verse says, he shall surely be healed, meaning get him to a doctor. So isn't that a contradiction? So the rabbis say, no, of course it's not a contradiction. Someone is injured, someone is ill, we get him to the best medical attention that's available, and we also pray to God that the medical expertise should work on that particular patient. So it's a partnership with God, not in opposition to God. Now, Christian scientists, for example, take a different view, right? They view any kind of medical intervention as opposing divine will. If you have a headache, how dare you take 2 Tylenol? God gave you a headache, and if he wants, God will take away the headache. Or God forbid someone has cancer, how dare you go for treatment? So the Bible does not take that view. We take the view that we are, in many areas, we are partners with God. We pray that the medical expertise they're given should help that particular patient. No different than if someone stays home the whole day and prays they should make a living, it ain't going to happen. You got to do what you have to do, whether it's a farmer, a stockbroker, etc. And then you pray to God that what you're doing is successful.
So, Lori, I believe you're still on. Would you like to ask Rabbi Wolk your question?
Sure. I was confused about the advice to not directly address the issues that a dying person is going through. I've been in the position to not be able to address the dying person's dying, and it felt unethical to me. So I'm just wondering if why it is that we shouldn't address that the person is dying.
Okay, I didn't mean not to address it. I mean to address their concerns, but not to be so detailed that it'll take away from them any will to live. Okay? There's a difference between saying to the person, Mom, the doctors give you, 2 more weeks, or to say things are very serious. The doctors are doing as much as they can. We're hopeful, but things are very serious.
So, so I hear that, the hope, but isn't acknowledging the reality that they are dying important too?
It is acknowledging it, just like in the confession prayer that I mentioned. It says, if I am to die, let this my confession be an atonement for my sins.
Okay, I understand. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking.
Okay, what about Fort Worth? Are there any funeral homes? I'm not sure what that is.
Harper Funeral Home that's worked with the Jewish community for decades. That's a free plug. I don't get a kickback from them.
Robertson Mueller Harper also does in Fort Worth.
What does?
Robertson Mueller Harper.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is there a specific?
For sure I won't get a kickback from them because I mentioned. Go ahead, please.
Is there a specific protocol in place to handle the deceased who died from COVID?
Oh, that's a very good question. That's every burial society in the world has been dealing with this for the last year. Basically, well, first they wore all kinds of the the hood, like a hazmat uniforms, and just the minimal was done. Not a full washing of the body. Not dressing the person in shrouds. The shrouds were simply put over the body of the deceased, because the health of the burial society, that comes first. The health of every individual comes first, even ahead of respect for the deceased. So we all that we put by the side. Just did the minimal things. That's correct. In the same vein as for like many houses of worship, synagogues in Dallas all over the world were closed for months upon months because simply it was not safe to go into a building, and so we had no people prayed at home. Just like other faiths were closed down. So yes, we took special precautions because of the COVID.
Can you explain why a funeral cannot be performed on Friday and Saturday?
Yeah, thank you. Because the Sabbath, that is, even though it comes once a week, that is the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, even holier than the Day of Atonement. Day of Atonement is the most solemn day, Yom Kippur, but the Sabbath is the most holy day. So nothing comes before the Sabbath, before the sanctity of the Sabbath, except, as I mentioned earlier, except when there's a threat or a potential threat to human life. So that's why we have no funerals on the Sabbath or on major holidays like the first 2 days of Passover.
Are Shiva chairs rarely used? As I've been to many Shiva services / gatherings, and I've never heard of them or seen them.
Okay, so that's certainly done in a more traditional setting. So going back to an earlier question, if it's a family that's associated with, let's say, a Reformed temple, then you wouldn't see it. But with the Orthodox congregation or some conservative congregations, you would see it. There's nothing magical about it. They take a nice, comfortable chair with padding and a back and arms, and they shorten the legs on it to make it lower. That's the idea. The mourner sits on a lower chair than he normally does. The Sabbath, just so one other question, right? The Sabbath begins Friday evening at sundown. That's based upon chapter 1 in Genesis. It says there was evening and there was morning, one day, a second day. So evening, the Jewish day goes from sunset to sunset. That's why the Sabbath begins Friday night at sunset. That's why Jewish holidays begin at sunset. Different than the English calendar, right? On the civil calendar, midnight is when the day changes. On the Jewish calendar, it's sundown.
Why does the Jewish tradition not allow open casket funerals and viewing the body?
Okay, that's a very good, important question. We, again, different faiths take different approaches, and that's the way it should be. We believe, from a Jewish perspective, viewing the deceased is not considered respectful. Okay, we'll have someone identify the body, and that's sometimes done even after the preparation has been done, just to make sure there's no mix-up. But viewing of the body of the person, we view that as not respectful to the person, and that's why we do a closed casket funeral.
Since the preservation of life is highly regarded, how do rabbis support families of a patient who committed suicide?
Okay. The Jewish definition of suicide is different than an insurance company's definition, or the police, or the newspapers, let's say. The Talmud says about a suicide, someone who does away with himself with his full mental faculties. Okay. Meaning what? If there was a reason, the person was unstable mentally, if the person was seeing a psychiatrist, etc., we believe that that person didn't commit suicide of his own volition. But there were reasons that he did it, that it wasn't his true self doing it. Thank God in my rabbinic career, I've only dealt with that situation 2 or 3 times. And all the times I declared that the person should not be considered a suicide. And the burial society and everyone, those who came to the funeral, we treated those persons like everyone else. So we have a very different definition. They've done studies on people who have committed suicide and were not successful. And in all the cases, when the person fired the gun or jumped out the window, in all the cases, their initial feeling was one of regret. They wanted to take it back. So that indicates that it wasn't the person really himself who was doing it. So, and it doesn't even have to be that formerly the person was seeing a psychiatrist. If people knew that he was under great mental pressure because of a failing business, then he took a gun to himself, God forbid, that person is not declared as suicide, because there are a lot of ramifications. A person who would be considered a suicide by Jewish law, you don't bury such a person in a Jewish cemetery. The family doesn't do any mourning rituals. So I've never heard of a case where the person was declared as suicide. So that's an important question. He said the insurance company will call him a suicide, but not a suicide by Jewish law.
Okay, looks like we have the final question. Texas allows for green burials. Are you aware of any Jewish families utilizing green burials?
Yeah, there is a green burial cemetery in Austin.
All right.
That's as much as I know.
Perfect. Okay.
Somebody asked us, what is a green burial? Maybe someone else can explain it better than me. I mean, it's burial in the ground, right? As far as I know, right?
directly.
Yeah, that was my question. And it's when you were talking about in the United States, the Jewish person is put into a casket to be buried because it's required. And the green burials don't require a casket. You can be just shrouded and place direct body into the
That
casket.
would be, if local law allowed it, that would be fine according to Jewish law.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Rabbi Wolk, thank you for your time, your expertise, your dedication to patients and families in need, and your continued support with Faith Presbyterian Hospice.
Appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation, Beth, and wonderful. I hope the next time we talk will be in person.
Yes.